Hi, this is Tim Gibbs with the Delaware Academy of Medicine, and welcome to the next installment of Delaware Mini Medical School. Today we're joined by Dr. David York, who specializes in psychological assessment and integrated primary care behavioral health at Christiana Care. He earned his doctoral degree from the University of Pennsylvania and completed a pre- and postdoctoral internship at the Institute of the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. Dr. York, over to you. Thank you.
I know that initially we were going to do this live. I'm really happy that Tim Gibbs could set this up so that we can do it virtually. And it's a bit of an experiment, but I hope that it'll all turn out well, and we'll see how this goes. So today I'm going to be talking about psychological assessment. And as a psychologist, this is my specific area of specialty. And I like to, the subtitle to this presentation is The Clinical Science of Understanding Behavior and also experience. And I would really emphasize the experience as much as the behavior. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I thought that it would be helpful to begin by just helping people understand what a psychologist is and how that is different from some of the other types of behavioral health professionals. Many of you may already know this from what Tim described. You're probably a fairly educated group. But even then, I think it can be sometimes confusing as to what the different types of mental health professionals do. And that's relevant to understanding what I do. So let's just take a brief tour through those different professions. Probably the prototype for a mental health professional is the psychiatrist, right? So psychiatrists attend medical school. They earn either an MD or a DO, right? DO is just the doctor of osteopathic medicine, which is a slightly more holistic type of learning. And as physicians, they focus primarily on biological aspects of, in this case, mental illness. And because of their training, their primary tool is medication as physicians. In the current era, mostly psychiatrists prescribe medications, and typically they interview people about their symptoms. Sometimes psychiatrists do include talk therapy or psychotherapy with their medication treatment, but that's fairly rare these days. A lot of that has to do with market pressure. There's such a high need, and the insurance companies really pay for psychiatrists to really be medication specialists. So that's a psychiatrist. The other type of mental health or behavioral health specialty is social workers, right? And a social worker often carries the degree of a MSW or Master of Social Work, and that allows them to become a licensed clinical social worker. Many of my colleagues here at the hospital who work in behavioral health are LCSW, MSWs. And typically their training involves 2 years of graduate coursework and then a lot of practical experience working at agencies in the community. When people get their masters, they are trained to do psychotherapy, and oftentimes the emphasis in social work is, consistent with the philosophy of social work, is training people to support and advocate for people who don't have resources, right? So social issues. And this is a movement that, social work was a movement back, I believe, at the turn of the century, of the 19th century, that is. So, or actually the 20th century, 1900s. Things like poverty or immigration or homelessness or domestic violence, those are the kinds of areas in which social workers often are trained to work. Let's see here. All right, so we've got that. And then we get to the type of mental health professional that I am, a psychologist, right? So psychologists have either PhDs or what's known as a PsyD. The distinction is that a PhD is usually, the training involves a lot of emphasis on research and doing research. So learning how to conduct experiments, run experiments, write up experiments, and publish them. The PsyD is more of a clinical degree. And so people who get PsyDs are really, hopefully, they've started with an interest in serving as clinical psychologists. Now, the boundaries are not as blurry or not as clear as they used to be. They're a little bit more blurry, so that certainly lots of PhDs don't do research. They are therapists, and some PsyDs do research, but those general distinctions do hold. The distinction that I would encourage you to think about when you think about psychologists is that the emphasis is really on, again, the research and the scientific methods, and also on the individual. So that makes it different from the social work, which is more interested in broader social issues and groups in some ways. And so the important thing here is that one of the aspects of psychology is that the experimental background and the research background naturally leads psychologists to use psychological tests. And we'll talk more about this later in the presentation, but some of us, like myself, are especially trained in psychological testing, the administration and the interpretation of tests to help people. And obviously that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so, all right, so what I'd like to do, actually, let's step back here and just say a couple things. So I'm going to go through a bunch of different terms today and try to define, kind of what I do and how it is that I do it. And then once we get through the sort of the conceptualization of this endeavor, right, the psychological assessment endeavor, then I'm going to present a case to you, and my hope is that the case will help illustrate a number of the principles and concepts that we talk about. Okay, so let's start out with defining psychological assessment. One really nice definition of psychological assessment is that it involves the use of psychological tests along with other methods and procedures to understand individuals at a deep level and optimally in a comprehensive manner, right? And this deep holistic understanding can do a number of valuable things. It can inform conceptualization, right? So it can help us understand. We can use that conceptualization to guide decision-making, right, in many different forms, but here we're often, in my work, we're often talking about treatment decisions, but they can be case management decisions, they can be educational decisions in some contexts, and then in other contexts that I'm less involved in, it could be even legal decisions, right, or employment decisions. We can also and this is where I'm very interested, this is my area of interest, is it can, using these tests to understand people can enhance an individual's understanding, and it can also promote their psychological growth. So my hope is that I'm going to be able to show you some of that today. Okay, so one question that people might ask, and I often am faced with, is, when is it a good idea to refer someone for a psychological assessment, right? Certainly we don't, my colleagues who are therapists or who are psychiatrists don't refer everyone to me, or I would not be talking to you today. I'd be working like a dog. But when do we refer, right? When is it helpful to use tests? When is it not helpful? So one way to think about this, and the way that I like to define it for my colleagues, is that really psychological assessment is most useful to psychiatrists, to therapists, and to the clients, okay, or to other mental or healthcare professionals. It's most useful when the professional is perplexed by the patient's presentation, right? Like maybe they have symptoms of different disorders, or it's hard to understand what exactly is going on with the patient. Or when the patient hasn't, him or herself, responded to, the usual treatment, right? So in those cases, that's when the psychological assessment process can be very helpful. Okay, so basically, to boil it down, when cases are complex or hard to understand. All right, so that's a bit of an overview. Let's talk about some additional concepts that I think are really helpful. So one valuable distinction is thinking about the difference between psychological testing versus assessment. And in some ways, these are just words. but they're important distinctions. So let me try to make this distinction to you. My hope is that you'll carry this distinction with you in your mind after you go through this presentation with me. So psychological testing, we can define that as a relatively straightforward process where we use a particular scale or measure and we administer it and we get a score out of that scale. And then we describe some trait or characteristic that the person might have. We describe their placement on that scale, right? So, in clinical work, it could be depression, right? So to what extent does a person have, are they describing symptoms of depression? Or in non-clinical work, it could be something like altruism. Not that you couldn't do that in clinical work, but, I'm thinking of research studies, right? So altruism, right? Are they high in altruism or are they low in altruism? Authoritarianism. Are they high in authoritarianism or are they low in authoritarianism? Right. So it's really just giving people that scale and then getting a score and then interpreting the score. Okay, so that's testing, right? Now, here's an interesting paradox, right? Let's take a look at this as an illustration of, this will lead to the distinction here. So looking at, just using an example that I found in the literature, the Kansas Marital Satisfaction Scale, right? So that's just a measure of marital satisfaction. Apparently it's a questionnaire. If you respond to 21 items, you get a score for each item, and then, or actually that's not true. I don't know how many items there are, but there's 21 possible points, right? So if you give this to a bunch of people, it turns out that the average of a sample, a typical sample, the mean is 18 points out of a possible 21 points, right? So that would suggest in and of itself that marital satisfaction is really high, right? All right, so that works. That's an interesting finding. You might works to look at is that it illustrates the fact that if we just interpret a test score without looking at the context, then we may be misled by what that test score tells us, right? So testing can be helpful, but sometimes the context, and I would argue that oftentimes the context is very important in terms of understanding what's going on with the test score, right? There are lots of different ways of talking about that, but this is just one of them. Now, one of the things that we can start to do, even here, talking about this example, is we can think about why would that be? Why would it be that people are reporting such a high level of marital satisfaction when the divorce rate is actually 50%? And, if we were meeting live, I might even try to get people to comment on this. There's two hypotheses that come to my mind fairly quickly, and there's probably others that I'm not thinking about right now. But the first two are that, this is a self-report measure, and people probably have a tendency to describe themselves in a socially desirable way, right? Like they want to present themselves in a positive way. Because even though they're filling out a form, they are still doing it within the context of the relationship with whoever is administering the form, right? So there's a social context there. The other possibility is that people may not be fully aware of the many different feelings that they might have about their marriage. And hopefully we'll get to talk about that a little bit further, that concept that people can have multiple different motivations or feelings. Okay, so this is an illustration. Let's go on and talk further about the distinction between testing versus assessment. So essentially what we can say is that when we do assessment, right, we are using tests, and actually I should go up here. I've got my cursor and I'm pointing it off the screen here. So we can use tests in the service of assessment, right? And the tests here are part of the whole picture. So we use test data, but we also collect historical data, right? So what went on in this person's life, right? We want to understand why they're coming in to see us, or why they're coming in to see their physician or their therapist. You know, what is it that's concerning them? We also want to observe how they behave toward us, and how they, so we can observe them like just in interacting with us. We can also, as we are wont to do, interview them extensively and asking them lots of questions about their current situation, any symptoms they might have, you know, their thoughts and feelings about a variety of different things through an interview. And we also want to, when we can, get information from third parties, right? So parents, siblings, children sometimes. It all depends on the context. Sometimes we interview them. Sometimes we give the people around the patient, let's call them, different questionnaires. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use all this data to develop a very comprehensive understanding of the person, that we can then take the test results and interpret those test results within this nuanced context, right? So that's the distinction between assessment and testing. So I and my colleagues argue that this and experience this is true, that this is far more complex, and it requires a pretty high level of skill and sophistication to be implemented well. But when done properly, it can be profoundly helpful in terms of helping people to understand themselves, particularly if they're struggling to make sense of their own experience, or if they're in a state of distress. Okay, so let's move on here. And let me just show you this. You know, I was initially going to read this out loud. I think I'll just let you guys read it on your own. This is a statement made by my colleague, Mark Blaise, who was up at Massachusetts General Hospital at a conference that I go to where he presented. And this is a really nice way to describe the assessment process, right? We're using these tests to sort of, almost in a way, sort out the important things, and then using this model with this data, we're almost sort of assembling a view of the person, right? And the important thing that I'll say here is that, you know, the last part is that he's saying, very importantly, we can't just throw tests at people. We need to actually have a framework for interpreting them, right? We need to have a framework for conceptualizing how the test data relate to the whole person, right? And the way that we do that is we think about theories of personality and theories of human behavior. So let's talk a little bit about that. First, let's walk through a couple of the more well-known and more well-used theories of behavior, right? Starting with the granddaddy, I guess, in some ways, going back to Freud, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, psychoanalysis, right? Fairly comprehensive theory of human psychological and behavioral functioning. Fairly controversial in some circles, but enduring in other ways. Humanistic and existential psychology, having to do with the experience of being human, right? The raw sort of just, you know, focusing on your lived experience. Also, the existential component is looking at, you know, issues of our mortality, right? The fact that we're not going to be here forever. Those are important perspectives. Also, behaviorism, coming from academic psychology, thinking, you know, trying to sort of not get too caught up in creating unobservable constructs that presumably live in the mind, but looking at the relationship between behavior and environmental stimuli and consequences. And then cognitive and behavioral therapy, the innovation here is thinking about how the way that we think about things can influence how we perceive things, and how that can really affect how we respond to environmental situations. That's a very an increasingly well-used perspective. Social developmental theory looks at, development of relationships and what happens over the course of our childhood and into our adulthood. With regard to relationships, family systems theory looks at the specific relationship of the family unit, right? So these are all different frameworks that we can use. And I would argue that, in high school and in college, you may have been exposed to these theories. They're often, presented by professors as sort of, competing hypotheses, and that is true, they are. But in the clinical world, we can often use these theories to match what's going on with the client, right? So one way to think about this is that the case can pull for the theory. And one way that I'll describe that is that, I might be working with one person and psychodynamic or psychoanalytic thoughts might start coming to me as I'm working with this person. The things that they're contending with, the issues that they have, are of that nature. Whereas with someone else, I might start thinking about, family systems theory and thinking about the role of the person in their family of origin. Whereas maybe other times, there seems to be a real strong relationship between a person's behavior and what's happening in their environment, right? So more of a behavioral approach. And so in clinical practice, clinicians tend to be much less doctrinaire, much more flexible in how they use theory, and really trying to tailor the theoretical conceptualization to match what seems to be going on with the patient, right? Okay, I'm looking at time here. It's been about a half an hour since I started talking. Let me just try to run through this very quickly. I have a lot of training in psychoanalytic and psychodynamic theory, and that is probably my preferred theory. It's not the theory that I always use, but I tend to go back to it. And one of the things that I would like to just mention here is that, psychoanalysis and Freud have been pronounced dead many, many times over. For some good reasons. There are some clear problems with the original Freudian formulations. But there are, psychoanalysis has really survived, and it's actually changed quite a bit, so that modern psychoanalysis does not resemble, in many ways, some of the doctrines, the original doctrines of Freud. In fact, this reference here, if people are interested, is a very nicely written monograph about psychodynamic thinking and how it can be looked at with regard to science using scientific methods. So let me just run through. This is actually kind of a very concise summary of that paper. So these are the postulates that continue to survive, and actually there's quite an abundance of evidence that these postulates may in fact be, really valid. So the first one is that much of mental life is unconscious. Again, I don't want to waste too much time on this, but there's tons and tons of research, including one of the more recent nice works that I've read is by Daniel Kahneman, who's I believe he's the only psychologist to ever win a Nobel Prize. And his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a great read. I would recommend it to all of you. That is one of the main ideas of his work, is there's lots of research showing that we don't always know ourselves, right? We also know that there's a lot of research showing that mental processes operate in parallel, right? So that we can have loving feelings towards someone and unloving feelings towards the same person, right? We can have conflicts. We can have different motivations, right? So that's the second one. The third one is that childhood experiences play an important role in personality development, right? Maybe not in the way that Freud described, right? You know, the notion that there's infant sexuality, people are not so fond of that idea. But there's lots of important ways that childhood experiences do play an important role in personality. Also, mental representations of ourselves and others, and the relationships between ourselves and others guide our interactions, influence our behavior, and also influence the development of psychological symptoms. And then the fifth one is that you know, personality development involves learning how we can regulate our sexual and aggressive feelings, right? And moving from immaturity, social dependence, moving from those states to a more mature state, a more what we can call interdependent one, right? With the idea that we're never completely independent, but we can be more dependent or more independent in some ways, although still needing help from others. Okay, so I wanted to just cover that briefly because some of the, when we get to the example, those ideas I think are going to be relevant. And I also think it's just helpful for you guys to be aware that psychoanalysis is still a very, very helpful perspective within behavioral health. Okay, so let's talk a little bit further here. So we've covered the difference between testing and assessment. We've talked about you know, making sure that we interpret the test data within a framework, right, a broader framework. And now let's talk a little bit about models of assessment. So here I'm going to compare and contrast two models of assessment. The first we can call the information gathering model, and the second we're going to call the therapeutic model. And the information gathering so-called paradigm is the paradigm that I was basically trained in, which is that essentially when I was on my psychological version of a residency, we call it an internship in psychology, I was there, I had a pre-doctoral and postdoctoral internship, so it was 2 years long. And I spent 2 years basically doing lots of assessments where a psychiatrist would refer the patient and they would have a question. And then I would meet with the patient and conduct this very comprehensive battery, and I'd write a report. And then I would send the report back to the psychiatrist. Sometimes I would call them and go over the results on the phone. And then the psychiatrist might share the results with the patient, right? So that's what we would call the information gathering approach, where the goal of the assessment was to collect data, and that data would be communicated to the referring party, and that would help decisions to get made about the patient, right? Now, as you can see, that was not very patient-centric, and the patient was almost like, you know, a passive participant in that process for most of it. So in contrast, the therapeutic model of assessment proposes that the major goal is actually to help the client understand him or herself, and if possible, to facilitate some positive change in the client. So that's a radically different model. And let's talk a little bit further about the features of this so-called therapeutic assessment model, right? So yeah, let's see here. So how can I describe this? So there are two characteristics that really are the most prominent features of this therapeutic model that set it apart from the information gathering model. There are other things, but I'll just focus on two. And the first thing is that we want to engage the client in collaborative goal setting from the very start of our contact with the client, right? There's a lot of good reasons why we want to do this, right? And think about it. Like if I think about myself and I think about if I were a client and I wanted to get a psychological assessment, would I want, you know, say I was in therapy or say I was seeing a psychiatrist, would I want the psychiatrist to decide for me what was going to, what the questions were? I might want the psychiatrist to have input on that, but I would probably want to have a say in that, right? And maybe I would prefer it if we were in agreement, or that if there was some differences of perspective, that those were clear, right? So what we want to do is we want to enfranchise the client by asking them, what do you want to learn about yourself, right? What is it that you're struggling with that I can try to help you to understand? And what we find is that process really shifts and allows the client to feel much more engaged in the process, much more an active participant, and does a whole bunch of things that are listed on the slide, right? Including, once we have that dialogue, we are then able to, there's the potential for the client to use that dialogue, or to have the capacity to use that dialogue, to start considering new ways of looking at themselves that they may not have considered before. And ultimately, because of that, that can increase the likelihood that they may be able to make some helpful changes in their view of themselves and how they do things. Right? So collaborative goal setting. And let's see here, what else did I want to say about that? Oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to say about that is that, so part of this is that here we're actually using the relationship between the psychologist and the client as a kind of it's a part of the assessment, right? We're offering them a relationship, and then we're also, on our ends, we're able to learn something about them in how they respond to that, right? So many people would say, when I offer them, when I say, hey, look, your primary care doctor wants to know whether you have ADHD and or whether it could be anxiety or depression. What's your perspective about this? Is there something? Are there specific things that you want to know? They could be the same as, they could have to do with that question, but they could be different. When you ask people that, they're often very glad to be asked that, right? And they respond by engaging. However, that's not always the case. Some people may, it's relatively rare, but some people might say, you know what, no, I'm good. I'm just here because my doctor wants me to be here. I really don't have any questions for you, right? That is data in and of itself. So however the client responds to our overtures, that is helpful information. So what we get is, we have a psychiatrist, we have a primary care doctor, like in the last example I gave, maybe the primary care physician says, hey, Dr. York, can you help me to figure out whether this person has ADHD, or are they depressed, or do they have anxiety, or is there something else going on? That's a clinical question, right? So clients, as you might imagine, they're going to ask much more real life questions, like, plain language questions that you and I and everyone else probably has about themselves in at different times or different contexts, right? So for example, why do I avoid situations that involve confrontation, right? I mean, we've all probably done some of that, but maybe that's a major problem for one particular person. Here's another one. Why do I act so negatively to any criticism, right? I like the fourth one. Why do I get so mad at my mom, right? It was Mother's Day 2 weeks ago. And the last one is really interesting. Am I good at anything, right? That question in and of itself speaks volumes, right? And that really is a very interesting thing to try to help someone with. One of the critiques that has been leveled against psychology as a field is that, like psychiatry, we have tended to be really focused on, thinking about problems. And over the last 2 decades, one of our leaders, a guy named Martin Seligman, who's up at the University of Pennsylvania, has really promoted this notion of positive psychology, and focusing on, how can we be more attentive and really help people develop their positive qualities. And this is a good example of where positive psychology, that perspective, could come into play. We may not want to be focusing on clinical diagnoses, although maybe that is part of the picture. But what we might be more interested in is looking for the strengths of this person when they're doing all the tests. What are they good at, right? And perhaps even helping them recognize that they're good at certain things. So, so these questions really change the nature of the assessment. And okay, so another important concept here is that when assessment is therapeutic, okay, when we use this framework to think about assessment, we really start to recognize that while there's a premium that can be placed on the notion of objectivity, and that objectivity is something to be strived for, right, that we can recognize that not all tests are going to give us the so-called objective truth. They're going to tell us something about the client. But different people can respond to tests in different ways, and we might get into that a little bit later. A different way to look at tests is that tests can be looked at as empathy magnifiers, right? And this is a concept that was coined by one of my colleagues, a guy named Stephen Finn, who's down at the University of Texas at Austin. Stephen Finn is really the guy who has done the most writing and speaking and thinking about this notion of therapeutic assessment. So if you're interested in this and you want to read more, you can read his stuff. And the idea here is that if used in the right, from a helpful framework, that whatever the results of the tests are, that we can start taking those results and thinking about them in an empathic way. That is, I guess to be more specific, we can ask the question, what might have happened in this person's experience that might have led them to have a particular score or set of scores on this test, right? And when done in this way, when used in this manner, tests can be very powerful ways of understanding people that take them. Rather than, I have a score of 60 on this 100-point scale, and it places me here and there relative to other people. That's part of it, but we're really interested in what is the meaning of this, and how did that person get to the point where they have a particular score. Particularly if that score is unusual relative to most other people. Okay. All right, so let's see here, what's next? Oh yeah, so let's talk about the phases of the assessment process, right? So what does it look like to get in that psychological assessment? So, and actually I'll describe this sort of from the perspective of the psychologist. So the first thing that happens is that as the psychologist, I receive the referral from some third party. Often it's from some third party. Sometimes it's from the client, him or herself. And typically, we're going to try to gather whatever information is available from the person or the referral party. Sometimes, if they've been seen here at the hospital, I can go in and look at the medical record and get some information about the person. So we gather some information about them. And in doing so, we try to develop initial hypotheses, right? Like the referring party, if there is one, might have a hypothesis, or they might be struggling to figure something out. The person, if it's coming directly, if the person is referred themselves, so to speak, they might have their own idea about what's going on. And importantly, we give ourselves permission to develop hypotheses that haven't been considered before, right? So we might see something that neither the client nor the clinician, the referring party, has considered, right? And then, of course, we interview the patient. And once we've done that, then, and I'm using the term we because I should actually qualify that. So I have a team of graduate students that work with me. So oftentimes when I'm getting a referral, I'm handing it off to one of my graduate students. And then, I and the student are working as a team where often they're doing the assessment and I'm sort of, I'm involved in the initial interview, but I'm largely behind the scenes. So, just an explanation for my jargon here. So, if I'm working with a student, the two of us are selecting the tests. And you know, I'm using the term method there and test because we have some things that are not formal tests, but a lot of them are formal tests. And then, of course, once we select the tests, we administer the tests. And one important thing about this therapeutic assessment approach is that basically, as we're administering tests, we are, again, you know, taking that dialogue forward. There's a notion where we standardize the administration because we want everyone to have the exact same instructions. But we also give ourselves permission to, once the standardized administration has been completed, we can test the limits, so to speak. We can ask questions, we can engage in conversation with the client, with the patient about his or her experience. And as we do that, we may develop new hypotheses or modify previous existing hypotheses. Sometimes we might abandon hypotheses, and that might lead us to add tests and or subtract tests, right? So we have kind of tests that we tend to use more often than not, but we also are not doctrinaire about which tests we use. So we don't have like a standard rigid battery that we give everyone the same exact tests as you might do in a research setting. And that allows us to be flexible and to really try to pursue and understand any particular new ideas that come up with the client as he or she is going through the testing process, the assessment process. So once we get all the data, it usually takes us a week or two to score it up. Some of the tests are fairly labor intensive in scoring and all that. And then we schedule a feedback session, and then we have the client, the patient come back, and then we sit down with them for about an hour and a half, and we go through the tests, the test results in detail, and we really look to find out from the client whether or not the findings and our interpretations of the findings really match their experience, right? And what we often find is that clients, you know, describe that the findings do fit their experience, but we also often find that people will give us new information. They'll tell us things that we hadn't actually heard until that point. And sometimes we will be helped to understand by the client that our initial interpretation was not so accurate, and that we may end up modifying our initial interpretation considerably as a result of the feedback session, right? So then once we do that, you know, usually we've started writing the report before then. Oftentimes we're not necessarily done it by the time we get to the feedback session, but typically we're giving the client a written document that describes the results. What we try to do, if we can, is to write that in what we would call an experience near manner, right? We want to try to if we can, avoid a lot of the technical jargon, or we could include that, but then we can also try to capture their lived experience by describing how the information might help understand their behavior in their real life, in their daily life. And then we also, when we can, we get feedback from the client about how they've experienced the assessment. So I have a couple of questionnaires that I use. One is developed by this guy, Steve Finn. The other is one that I developed. You know, we are glad to hear that oftentimes our people do really find them the assessments to sort of help them understand themselves in a deep way. Sometimes we get some interesting constructive feedback, and that's really helpful to us because, you know, the power of the dialogue is something that that I believe in firmly, and that has proven itself to be helpful over and over again. Okay, so let's see here. I'm going to talk about a case. So yeah, actually, before we jump into that, so just to review, we talked a little bit about, you know, what do psychologists do, you know, and then talking about psychologists who do psychological assessment. Then we talked about assessment as something that is different than just testing, throwing tests at people, and the importance of integrating test findings with a comprehensive understanding of personality and human behavior. And then now we're talking about, we just got done talking about the notion that the assessment process can in and of itself enhance growth, right? And that's something that, again, I've said this before, but it's something that I find really satisfying. And I would argue, actually, as an aside, that I think the validity of the assessment is enhanced when the client is deeply engaged in the assessment. Now, there are some contexts where the situation may not permit there to be a lot of trust and openness, right? So forensic contexts or employment contexts, those are situations where people tend to want to present in their best light, and it's really in their interests to do. But in clinical contexts where you can develop trust and where it's appropriate to do so, the validity of the assessment can really be enhanced by approaching it in this way. All right, so let's see here. I think what I'm going to do right now is let's get started with the case study. I think I know that there's some, the timer that I'm looking at on my screen is a little bit different than probably the starting time that's going to be on the presentation. So I'm just approximating how long we've been. And I'm guessing that we probably have about 15 more minutes before an hour is up. So I'm going to keep going for a little while. If we have more material to cover, I'll take a break at that point, and then we can come back and wrap up with the case study. But there's a lot of detail to the case study, so I might as well keep going and get started with it. All right, so lots of information. I'm hoping that you guys are finding this useful, and certainly if people have questions, they are welcome to email me. And it's pretty easy to find me on the internet. It's dyork@christianacare.org. Okay, so let's talk about the case study. I've seen some presentations of the other presenters, and I know that a number of us have given people case studies. Just because of the nature of the work that I do, I want to be very explicit here that this is a real person, but I radically altered the demographics of the case to make sure that the patient's privacy would be protected. So I would let you know that, even if you think that this person, my description of this case reminds you of someone, the chances are very, very low that that you would know this person. In fact, I would argue that if the person, him or herself, was watching this, they probably would not recognize themselves unless they remembered some of the specific results. Okay, so I just wanted to say that because, in contrast to some of the medical stuff, which, can be very detailed, but not so involved in terms of, interpersonal and emotional stuff and personal details. This is, we're going to get into a bunch of details. And I've tried to capture the flavor of the case without, at the same time of protecting the patient's privacy. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the case. All right, so I've named this patient Jonathan Rodriguez. That's not anything near his real name. And so this is an 18-year-old male. He's living with his parents, and he has two younger sibs. They live in Pennsylvania near the Delaware border. As many of you probably know, or maybe some of you do this, you may live in PA yourself and come to Delaware for services here at Christiana. And so that was the context here. The family is Hispanic, originating in South America, or actually Central America. And let's see here. So his mother is a financial consultant, and his father is an assistant principal of a local high school in the area where they live. John, when he came for the assessment, was a high school senior, and he was preparing for college. And he was generally in good physical and neurological health, right? He had had a pretty unremarkable developmental upbringing, medical history was minimal in terms of problems. And so he was referred by his psychotherapist. And so this is kind of a traditional case where the therapist referred. And the therapist's question was, does John have bipolar affective disorder, right? So bipolar affective disorder is the official jargon for what many people just refer to as bipolar disorder, or some people will say just bipolar, right? So that's a disorder that many people know of in the popular culture, and we're going to talk about it a little bit in detail today. And actually, before I go on, let me say that the therapist referred him because, and there's more detail here, but the therapist had worked with John for a number of sessions, and John had previously seen a psychiatrist who had diagnosed him with bipolar disorder and placed him on some medication. And those medicines are fairly, they're pretty, what's a good way to describe them? They have a lot of, they can have a lot of side effects, and, they're fairly sedating, or they can be. So the therapist was not impressed by John's, what's a good way to describe it? The therapist didn't think that John displayed many features of what would be expected for someone who carried a bipolar diagnosis, right? And again, we'll talk about that shortly. But that was the context here. So that was the question that was raised, and then the therapist wanted me, and in this case, I had a student working with me, to try to figure out whether this person really had a bipolar disorder or might not. Okay. All right, so let's just go into hopefully in a fairly brief way, what is bipolar affective disorder. So the number one criterion is that you have to have what's called a manic episode. And we're going to talk about that in detail in just a moment. But let me just go through the overarching features of bipolar disorder. So you have to have a manic episode, but the manic episode may be preceded or followed by what can be called a hypomanic episode, and which is sort of like mania, but not as severe. Some people might use the term mania light, right? Like it's sort of a lighter version of mania, less severe version. Or they could be preceded by or followed by a major depressive episode, right? So that's the big picture of bipolar disorder, is alternating episodes of either mania and or depression, or sort of mild mania, that is hypomania, and depression. And so just a little bit of historical context here. The disorder used to be called manic depressive disorder, and which was essentially just a more straightforward description of the fact that people with this condition will vacillate in their moods. And oftentimes the mood swings are tremendous. They're very dramatic, and they're fairly, what's a good way to describe it? They're fairly impressive. Most people would recognize them. The average person would recognize there's something going on with this person, because they're so, they act so differently across time. Okay, so, and then the last thing is that, of course, these symptoms should not be better explained by other psychiatric conditions, right? Like, so people with, sometimes people can have depression without the mania, right? Or sometimes people can have, a more severe condition, arguably, is schizophrenia. And sometimes people with schizophrenia can have these kinds of symptoms. Or sometimes people with a substance abuse problem can look manic. If you're abusing speed or I don't know, maybe sort of psychedelics, if you're taking those, while you're taking those, you could look manic, right? So there's lots of ways that people can have certain symptoms, but if we look under the hood and recognize the context, it might not be bipolar disorder. Okay, so what is mania? All right, so mania is a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated expansive or irritable mood, and abnormally and persistently increased goal-directed activity or energy lasting at least 1 week and present most of the day, nearly every day. Okay, so in some ways it's not specific, but in other ways it's very specific, right? In some ways it might not be as specific as some people might like, but the idea that it has to be abnormal and persistent increase in goal-directed activity, and that it has to also be a change in mood, and that it has to last at least a week, and that it has to be present most of the day, nearly every day, that eliminates a lot of normal human experience, right? So if we as psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers ask people to describe what's happening, and we have this framework in mind, we can start to make decisions about whether someone might be actually having a manic episode or not. The other interesting thing is that people who are in a manic episode often will not have insight to it, so we might have to ask people around them to give us a better sense of what's happening, right? But that's the basic thing. During this period, this episode, there has to be there's sort of a Chinese menu here, right? You go down and you have 7 items, and you can in some situations you can pick 3, and in other situations you can pick 4. That all depends on how severe the mood disturbance is, or whether it's merely irritability, right? So grandiosity, decreased need for sleep, being more talkative than usual, or being pressured in your speech, like you almost can't stop talking, or you interrupt people. Flight of ideas, right? Your thoughts are churning, or like the criterion says, your thoughts can be racing, right? It feels just like you're going from one thought to the next, almost as if you can't even stay with the last thought. Being distractible, right? You could experience that if you're the patient. That could be observed in you if you're not the patient. Or did I say that right? By others, right? Also, an increase in goal-directed activity, right? So oftentimes people with mania have some project that they are working on, like they're going to repaint the house in 1 day, or they have an invention that they think is going to make them rich and famous, or they're off doing things. They're on the go, like more than just like someone who has 3 kids or something who's running all day, but they're agitated. They almost can't stop moving. And then the last feature is that quite often, but not always, people with mania are engaged in some basically risk-taking behavior, right? Their inhibitions are lowered, so they're doing something like gambling, driving their car really fast, drinking and or drugging, engaging in sexual activity that is, promiscuous and unplanned and unthought through, and those kinds of things. Any of those things or others can be, they all have very potentially dire consequences, right? So anyway, that's mania. So let's talk about the case. We're hitting, let's see here, I'm going to go for another 10 minutes and then we'll take a break. I think that should be right. Okay, so let's talk about Jonathan. So let's talk a little bit about how he presented for the assessment. So Jonathan came to the assessment accompanied by his father, so his father brought him in. Initially, the dad did a lot of talking, Mr. Rodriguez, and John was actually fairly sort of retiring and a little shy at the beginning, clearly kind of anxious. Dad described how John had been treated by a psychiatrist who diagnosed bipolar disorder, and the psychiatrist prescribed some medicine, and Dad and reportedly Mom were concerned about the long-term effects of this powerful medication, particularly in light of their doubts about the diagnosis, right? So that was the heart of the matter. Mr. Rodriguez and John also expressed interest in understanding John's learning abilities and style. It turned out that John had not been a stellar student, and that as the student and I explored in the interview John's history of education, it turned out that John had, according to John and his dad, there had never been a school psychology evaluation, which is very common when kids are struggling and they clearly need more help than typical. And however, he had been provided with accommodations in high school. And there are a couple of different levels of accommodations that can be provided. One of them is something called a 504 plan. The other is called an individualized education plan, or IEP. And apparently John had been given a 504 plan, which is sort of like a less intensive, but still, higher than average level of support. So that was something that we hadn't heard from the therapist that was important. All right, so let's talk a little bit about his, his description of himself and his family and his history. So John described his mother in a very inconsistent way, right? On one hand, he described her as an angel or a saint. On the other hand, at times he referred to her as irritable, rigid, and controlling, and said that she can lash out or be angry. And he reported that his mother was, while she was working as a financial consultant, she was also trying to develop a second career as a motivational speaker. That was interesting, and we hadn't heard anything about that. He also said that she will advise John and his siblings when there's rifts or conflicts at home, but she will not coddle us, was his description. He also said that he really has not shared his difficulties with her fully because he expects that she wouldn't really understand him. At the same time, he also said that he believes that he may have inherited some of his own irritability, his self-described irritability and temper from his mother. So very complex description of his mother. His description of his father was relatively consistent, right? Described his father as very calm at home, John described him as his best friend. He has confided in his father about his difficulties. His father said that so his father did a lot of talking too, that his father was very upset when John acknowledged that he had symptoms of depression in the past. And also, it turns out that John had engaged in some self-harming behavior. And that was very distressing for everyone in the family, but particularly John's dad. But as John's dad learned more about John's difficulties, I think the two of them together described John and his father as becoming closer, and that his father was very supportive as he sought to understand the difficulties that John was going through. John's dad also mentioned that he worried about the stigma that people would attach to John's mental health concerns, and noted that he had not told the extended family about the 504 plan or the diagnosis. Right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some specific interview types of things, additional interviews types of things. So John described basically a long history of low self-esteem, not thinking well of himself, having a lot of anxiety about school performance. And he also described himself as having some obsessive and compulsive tendencies. Which was, again, the therapist initially was focused on the bipolar diagnosis, and that was something that we hadn't, that seemed new to us when we interviewed him. However, despite these difficulties, he was a very socially involved guy, had a pretty good social life until the spring of his junior year. Then apparently when he was away on vacation, I think it might have been spring break, he had an episode of sudden intense anxiety. And attached to this intense anxiety was the fear of looking stupid or of embarrassing himself. And because he was afraid of those things, he became worried about who he would see in public. And then another element was that he was afraid that his father would not be there for him. So I think he really viewed his father as a resource, and was afraid that of how he would handle things if he was alone in his father's absence. Okay. As a result of these symptoms, his interest in his usual life activities decreased. He felt like he didn't want to do much. He became more socially isolated, although apparently he did maintain some of his closest friendships. So one way to think about it, as I understood it, was that his acquaintances sort of went by the wayside, but he did maintain a number of his friendships. And not unexpectedly, he became depressed. And around that time, he did experience some suicidal thoughts, and he did start to cut himself. So that was sort of the history that brought him into treatment. He also reported some symptoms of obsessive and compulsive, possibly obsessive compulsive disorder. He described these as really kind of manifesting during his sophomore year of high school. And one component was of this set of symptoms was that he felt like if he didn't do certain behaviors, right? So compulsion is a feeling like you have to do something, that he felt like he had to do certain things or else someone would die. And it turned out that someone that he was worried about was often his father. And let's see here. All right, so now interestingly enough, clearly a lot of this guy is experiencing a ton of distress and, is really reaching out for help and wanting help. But at the same time, one of the interesting things about him was that he described himself as someone who other people would often go to for advice, to listen to them, to act as their counselor. And in the interview, he often used like psychiatric or diagnostic jargon to describe his experiences. And he also noted that he wanted to study psychology when he goes to college, right? So amid a lot of distress and, kind of thinking and talking about himself negatively, there was this very interesting component of what seemed to us to be a kind of a strength or an asset, and maybe even a set of strengths and assets, and it's also an interest, right? All right, let's see here. So Jonathan said that he had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder because not only, according to him, did he experience depression, but he also described himself as having manic episodes where he feels either highly irritable or elated. And again, kind of going back to what I said before, he had a little bit of an air of authority when he described himself, and said, in a kind of a confident way, I'm not a severe manic and I have no psychosis, right? So I think he had done some reading about mania, and I think actually I'm looking at some of my notes here. He described having multiple mood states in a single day, and he was describing himself as sort of that his moods would cycle in about a 3-day period, right? Now, we should probably take a break in a couple minutes. Let me see if I can find a place to wrap up here while we can take a break. So yeah, let's do this. Let's talk a little bit more. So Jonathan acknowledged in the interview that his parents and his therapist doubted, had expressed doubts to him about whether he meets criteria for bipolar disorder. And he had some rationales that he used to kind of dismiss these contrarian opinions, if you would. He said that really the therapist has only known him since he's been taking the medicine, and allegedly, he improved as a result of taking the medicine. And then he claimed that his parents only see the lows and not the highs, right? So, we can start to see that there are some discrepancies in the presentation where John is viewing himself one way, and his parents and even his therapist are viewing himself a different way. I'll tell you what. Let's go for a couple more, and then we'll stop. All right. So couple of other things. So going back to the school-related stuff, he acknowledged that he really struggled with attention and learning with school, viewed himself as a bad test taker, described how those difficulties gave rise to school-related social anxiety. And he also described having difficulty sitting still and concentrating in class. He said, my mind is constantly going, and he also described talking constantly. And he believed that the difficulties with concentration and staying still were related to the school performance anxiety. Okay, so that was all the content. Most of that was the content of the interview, although I was interjecting my observations. You know, one of the ways that we sort of parse things out when we write the reports and when we think about things is we can also look at not just the content of what a person says, but also, you know, how they behave when they're interacting with us. And sometimes actually how they behave toward some of the office staff, which can also be very interesting and informative. So, you know, during the joint interview with his father, John he tended to be fairly anxious, fidgety, uncomfortable. You know, like I mentioned before, at the beginning, the dad answered a lot of questions and kind of was the lead respondent. And then over time, you know, John seemed to relax. And then we encouraged him more and more to try to answer directly. And now, interestingly enough, then when he came back for the assessment session where we administered the tests, he worked primarily with one of my graduate students, who is a much younger woman, probably in her early 20s, who, you know, was much closer to John's age. And during that interaction, my student described him as being relatively calm throughout the test administration section, and that he really was very engaged and provided a lot of rich answers. She also noticed, the student noticed, that, you know, he did exert his best effort, but that when he experienced difficulties, he often became anxious and somewhat demoralized, like he would sort of, you know, stop trying fairly quickly and seem to attribute his difficulties to some, you know, enduring inability rather than some temporary setback. Okay, so that's a lot of data, right? So one of the things that we can start doing is we can start, you know, and hopefully you've been doing this as I've been talking, we can start developing hypotheses, right? We can think about what's come to your mind. Have there been questions? Can you take those questions and develop them into what we call hypotheses, right? Hypotheses are just, you know, they can be like sort of mini theories, right? Theories about, in this case, you know, what might be responsible or play a role in John's difficulties. And then part of what we do in the psychological assessment endeavor is we're thinking about, well, what tests can we give that would help us to try to find support or find for or against some of these hypotheses. Ideally, we would have at least two hypotheses that would be competing, and we would see whether there was more evidence for one hypothesis than the other. Okay, let's take a break here. I'm going to break for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll wrap up. Okay, let's go ahead and start up again. All right, so we just finished with developing hypotheses and choosing tests. So let's talk a little bit more about the tests that we did. And let's see here. So brief foray into just thinking about science and the nature of science and how we apply science to clinical work. In terms of psychology, we can think about two different kinds of endeavors. In experimental psychology, which is often done not on people who are seeking help, but on, say on college campuses, on average people that are going to usually college students. It's often done in a laboratory, where there's some very controlled procedure where a researcher introduces some change in a variable and then monitors its effects on other variables. And generally speaking, we're looking at identifying overall general laws or principles, and we look at groups of people. In clinical contexts, we're doing our clinical work with people who want help, obviously. We do this work in clinical settings, in the natural setting of the clinic, if you would. And then, so typically, we're not able to manipulate variables because oftentimes that's not ethical. But what we can do instead is we can look at the correlations between naturally occurring variables. And we are often also typically focused on the individual rather than the group, and on helping them get relief from whatever it is that's distressing them. So those are some important differences. And one method that I use all the time is, this comes from some work done back in the 50s by some people named Campbell and Fisk, is what I think is a really helpful approach to assessment. And the idea here is that we can either validate or, disprove, if you would, invalidate certain hypotheses, or if we're looking at psychological traits, the presence or absence of those traits, by constructing a grid where, and I tell you what, I'm going to use the fancy features here. Let's use the laser pointer here. So what we do is we use multiple methods, right? And a method, originally they were referring to formal tests, right? Like a questionnaire that gave a score. But we can use that term method much more loosely and generally to refer to any modality or way of collecting data, or in some cases, well, let's just leave it there. Modality of collecting data would be the best way to think about it. And then we also have, so this is our y-axis, so to speak. And then our x-axis, the horizontal axis, is these are different traits, right? And so we might have, in their work, they were looking at the idea of, maybe it would be something like self-esteem versus authoritarianism versus gregariousness versus whatever, right? They were personality psychologists. Here in clinical work, we are often looking at things like, there are more hypotheses, right? So they don't have to be a specific trait, like a psychological trait, but they could be a characteristic or a feature. So it could be something like, is this person depressed? Depression could be one. That's not really a trait as we typically think of it, but that could be the first hypothesis. Is this person depressed? In John's case, it might be, does this person have a bipolar affective disorder? And then we can have opposing or different traits. And then what we would do is we would collect data with these different methods, and then we would look across the methods for the support or lack of support for each trait, right? So that gives us a structure within which to interpret the data. All right, so hopefully that makes sense to you. And let's turn that off here. And all right, so now let's go ahead. Sharing with you my experience of dealing with new technology. Okay, so let's see here. So let's talk about non-test procedures, right? So as we, I alluded to this before and kind of mentioned it in passing, we reviewed the treatment notes from the therapist because they were part of our system. And there were also prior other records, just general medical records. We gave Mr. Rodriguez a developmental history questionnaire, which was just, asking him lots of questions about John's development and asking him to write down his answers. We interviewed John, right? So these are, you can think about these different procedures as different modes of collecting data, different methodologies. The interview with John and his father, and then also what we call behavioral observations by myself and the student of our interactions with John and his father. All right. So this is a list of the tests that we gave him, gave John, and actually his parents. I'll get to that. And here, let's talk about the list. So the first 4 items, okay, from the, let's use our laser pointer again here, from the PHQ-9 down through what is the acronym is the Y box, right? These are all what I would call single domain questionnaires. Each questionnaire is designed to measure a specific psychological construct, right? So the first one, euphemistically called the patient health questionnaire, is actually a depression scale. The second one is, as advertised, is an anxiety scale. The third one is a scale that looks at symptoms of bipolar disorder. And so it's kind of a screening measure. And then the fourth one is a scale that looks at obsessive compulsive symptoms. So we provide all of these to the patient, and then he or she answers them. And then the next measure here, we call it the BASC. It's in its 3rd edition. So the convention is to use the acronyms and then tack on the edition number at the end, right? The BASC-3, as the jargon goes, is now what you'll see here is it's a more sophisticated global questionnaire that uses lots of different, that contains lots of different scales. And I really love these kinds of tests because they allow me and my colleagues to look at differential responding, right? To what extent is the person saying this about him or herself versus this, right? Whereas when you have these simple one construct scales, it's sort of almost an either or to what extent along one dimension. This is going to give us more nuanced information. The other thing that makes it more nuanced is that we give it both, it's got parallel forms, so we're going to give it to both John, self-report, and we're also going to give a version to each of his parents. And we can see how those things interact with each other, how they speak to each other, right? We also, and there are reasons for, and actually, all right, so let me back up here before I get too far ahead of myself and say that the first 2 we usually give to most people because anxiety and depression are so ubiquitous in people seeking help in our practice. The second or the third and fourth were selected primarily because those were some of the strong, symptoms that John was reporting. So we wanted to find out whether, on these structured measures, whether he would endorse those symptoms further. Now, the next measure, the BASC, looks at some of these items, although not all of them, and puts it into a larger context, right? Puts those symptoms into a broader array of possible symptoms so we can get some context. And then, so those are why we chose those. Then we knew that he was having difficulty in school, so we wanted to look at his cognitive abilities, right? Because one possibility is that, one question that we often ask when people have difficulties at work or at school is there some, does the person have the skills or the abilities, really, the abilities is probably a better word, to do the work, right? So, or is there some relative underdevelopment of cognitive abilities that might get in the way, right? So for school-aged kids, like through high school, one question you can ask is there like a learning disorder or a learning disability? Or some area of relative deficit that maybe it doesn't meet criteria for a learning disability, but it's a weakness that, if there were some remediation or interventions, the person could do a lot better. So we gave the Wechsler. The Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale is the sort of the most widely used test of intelligence. And it's in its 4th edition, as you can see. Then, in addition to that, we wanted to get a sense of academic skills. So, that was, the academic stuff was not the initial focus of the assessment, but seeing that came up and thinking that could contribute, we wanted to screen for a learning disability by getting a brief screening on key academic skills, right? So we call it the RAT, an unfortunate acronym, but it's the RAT5, and everyone remembers it well because it's got the funny little acronym, is really kind of a several scale screener looking at things like vocabulary and reading and math skills. Then last but certainly by far not least, the personality assessment inventory. We chose that because that is a self-report measure of symptoms, psychiatric symptoms basically, and related psychological constructs. And then we also gave one of my favorite tests of all time, the Rorschach Performance Assessment System, which is the contemporary system of using the famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, Rorschach inkblot cards. And as you're going to see, these provided some really valuable information. And the other thing I should point out here is that some of these tests are self-report measures, and you can think about self-report measures as telling us what the person knows about him or herself, right? Other tests are what we would call performance measures, like the Wechsler scale, right? He in this case, he is performing and we're observing and scoring. And then the Rorschach is also a performance-based measure, right? In those tests, actually, there's some difference here. The Wechsler, you kind of know whether you're doing well or not. One of the magical things about the Rorschach is that there are no clear demands, right? So in a way, you can think about the Rorschach as sort of giving us a sample of everyday behavior, like sort of natural behavior. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so those are the tests that we gave. Let me go on to the next slide. So then, as you can see here, what we did was we can take all that stuff and put it into this chart. So over on the left side, you can see that I've kind of introduced the names of the different tests, but not only just the names of the different tests, but we can also say, all right, so some of this we could talk about like interview, like method 2, you could think about that as the interview data. Method 1 is really, it's not a formal test at all. It's, what did all the treatment notes and records say, right? Because that's a kind of a source of data. Method 3 is, the observations that I and my graduate student had. And then below that, we have the more formal tests. So these are all, using that term loosely, these are all methods. They are methods. They're just not formal tests, not all of them. But they include formal tests. And that's one of the great things about assessment versus testing is that we're combining all these different data sources. So then on the top, across the horizontal axis, we can then insert our different hypotheses. And as you can see, I've generated some hypotheses which are relatively veridical to the ones that my graduate student and I generated. The most obvious one being, does this person have bipolar disorder, or do they have traits that or features that reflect bipolar disorder? Or here's some other ones. Could there be some cognitive factors that interfere with learning, right? That would be along the lines of, intelligence or learning disabilities. Could he have an unrealistic expectation of himself, or are his parents holding an unrealistic expectations of himself? You know, there were some interesting things that came up in the interview around separation and independence. You know, he's afraid to be away from his father. He has anxiety about his father getting hurt if he doesn't engage in certain behavioral rituals. Is there anxiety, and is it of a certain type? Does it come from a certain developmental problem, so to speak, or dilemma is maybe a better way to say that. And then another one could be, you know, rather than having a bipolar disorder, is this instead a case of someone who maybe his emotional regulation skills are underdeveloped, relatively underdeveloped, or maybe developed in a way that can be helpful to him in some contexts, but not in others, right? Okay, so this is the thinking that I engage in on a kind of a daily, weekly basis with cases, and I'm sharing that with you to help you to see under the hood of psychological assessments. So let's go further. Okay, so I'm going to try to be relatively brief with this because I'm realizing that I don't have a ton of time, and I don't want to keep you on too long. So I'm going to try to get through some of this quickly so we can get to some very interesting stuff a little bit later on. Okay, so let's just talk about the symptom self-report test. So the Y box, again, it's looking at OCD symptoms as advertised by its title. His responses did indicate, you know, were consistent with a diagnosis of OCD, right? So he endorsed the items that would suggest that he has OCD. That he meets that criteria. And that would suggest that perhaps he might benefit from treatment of those symptoms, right? And there are very specific treatments for OCD. All right, let's go on to the next one. The mood disorders questionnaire. Again, just to formally asking him the very specific diagnostic questions. He endorsed 8 out of 13 items. That exceeds the threshold, but doesn't necessarily give conclusive evidence, right? That's just his reporting of the details. So let's talk about self and observer ratings of behavior. This is the BASC. Okay, so now we're going to get into some heavy data, so bear with me, and hopefully this will make sense to you. So let's just start out by quick review. For some of you, others it might be new stuff. This is the normal distribution, okay? The tests that I use a lot use 2 types of scores. There's something called a T-score, and a T-score has an average of 50, and each standard deviation, excuse me, is 10 points. So, you know, the typical way to talk about this is that scores between 40 and 60 are in the average range. They're within the first standard deviation, and what that means is that about 68% of the population have scores within that range. The other score that we have is called a standard score, and you're going to see me use that primarily with the intelligence and achievement tests. The format here is that instead of 50 is the average, 100 is the average. It's set that way. It'll be that way until these tests stop getting used, which probably will be never. And then the standard deviation is 15 points. So the average, the first standard deviation goes from 85 to 115. Oftentimes we set the clinical cut points around the second standard deviation. You can see that when you look at percentiles, that means that if you're getting a score around 30 or below, a T-score of around 30 or below, that you're pretty far out on the distribution. You're below the 3rd percentile. On the other end, excuse me, if you have a score that's 70 or above, you're really high, again, far out in the distribution, around the 98th percentile. And then the corresponding numbers on the standard scale would be 70 and 130. I had to draw these in because I couldn't find on the internet a graph that had the standard scores. I have one in my office, but I'm working from home in this era. So my apologies for the, the scrawl. All right, so that's just a brief primer or review. So you're going to see, again, lots of data points here. I'm going to try to just give you the perspective from 30,000 feet. So John's test includes some items and scales that have to do with his attitude about school. And as you can see, those are elevated here. You can ignore the dotted lines. I don't even want to spend time getting into that. Because they're not any different. The real thing you want to look at is the circles with the solid lines. And then here is, these are all the clinical scales here that look at different types of clinical or behavioral problems. And we have the so-called internalizing problems, which are things like anxiety and depression and those sorts of things. And then over here, we have what used to be called the externalizing scales that have to do with sort of types of problems involving behavior, like that can be disruptive at times. So ADHD or hyperactivity or things like that. We have a different label here. I'm not sure what the reason for the change of label is, but that's basically what they are. And what we see here is that John is describing lots of difficulties, right? So 50 being the average, stuff there's an at-risk zone from 60 to 70. Then there's plenty of stuff above 70. John is describing certainly hitting the clinical zone, so to speak, with anxiety, with depression. The highest score is his sense of inadequacy, right? And then over here, describing difficulties with attention, with overactivity, and the combination thereof. And what you are probably noticing, those of you who are paying close attention, is that there are no scales for bipolarity, right? So that's a disadvantage of the scale. I believe that one of the reasons for that is that bipolarity is not so easy to measure and not so common in these kids, although some psychiatrists might argue with me about that. The test really was based upon the things that are most clinically useful to most clinicians and most patients. Now over here, another nice feature of this particular test is that not only do we look at problems, we look at strengths or resources. And here, the scale goes in the other direction. So the lower you go, which means the absence of certain skills or resources, then that would be of concern. And here, the lowest thing is self-esteem, kind of the converse of this scale over here, so that there's an interesting parallel between those scales. And then he's describing himself being at risk, having relatively low scores in terms of his self-reliance. We kind of saw that in the interview. And then interpersonal relationships, right? He might not have the most robust interpersonal relationships. So John is describing lots of distress is the bottom line. But we're also seeing that the quality of it is a little bit different than we might have anticipated, although we also have to qualify that by noticing that, we're not directly testing for bipolarity here. All right, mother's rating scale, look at this. The headline here is that while the scales are a little bit different, there's lots of overlap, and it's intended to be that way. We want to compare apples to apples. So there aren't any school-related scales, but a lot of the other scales correspond to scales on John's printout. And what we see here is that mom is not seeing John as having any problems, right? His scores are all in the average range. His highest scores, according to her, he's got maybe some trends to be a little bit anxious and maybe some slight issues with attention, but also on the skill and resource side, very little in the way of difficulties here. She's saying that maybe he's not so much of a leader, right? And that maybe he might have slight difficulties with adaptation. And let's see here. And what does that mean, adaptability? So the ability to adjust to changes in routines or plans, transition and recover when faced with difficulties or setbacks, right? That's what adaptability is. So he might have difficulty being flexible, is what that's telling us. Let's then go to dads, right? So this is dads. Dads is looking remarkably like moms, right? But a little bit different. Dad's saying, hey, John, I think John has some anxiety. And that's really the overarching thing. And then he's also, like, even more than Mom, actually, describing John as having pretty much no problems in terms of his skills. So he's seeing John as having a lot more resources than John sees himself, and even than his wife sees their son. So this is a very interesting and nuanced picture. And, you know, in some ways it leads to more questions, right? It's raising some questions. In some ways it's, I don't know that we've concluded anything yet, but what we're starting to see is that there's more to the picture than just, is this guy bipolar or not? So, which is usually the case, right? And which is why we do this more comprehensive assessment rather than throwing one or two brief tests at someone. Okay, so this is just a slide showing all of the profiles side by side. So you can see, you know, lots of elevations for John, minimal elevations for the mom, actually none, well, except for this one here. And then Dad has pretty much no elevations here, and then just the anxiety elevation. So clearly Mom and Dad are seeing John as much more functional and less distressed than John himself is. And we can be very curious about that. Is it that the parents aren't picking up on John's distress? And maybe John, I mean, why would we doubt John's distress, right? John is distressed, but his parents are not picking up on that. Or is there something about the way that John is looking at himself that leads him to feel more distressed than maybe other people experience him and see him? Those are all the kinds of questions that went through our minds as we looked at the data. All right, let's look at intelligence and achievement tests. So here, these are the main findings from the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. Again, you know, hopefully I prepared you for this. The scale changed, right? So no longer is 50 the average, but 100 is the average. And we have some very interesting findings here, right? So we're comparing him to other people his age, so other 18-year-olds. And here, what this is showing is that, you know, so the convention is that we set the strict average range to the scores from 90 to 109. And then the low average range is 80 to 89. And then what we call the borderline range goes from 70 to 79. And then below 70 would be basically impaired, or, you know, there's various terms we could use for levels of impairment here, but significantly below average. So what we're seeing here is that in some ways surprisingly, but in other ways not surprisingly, there is a fair amount of variability in John's cognitive abilities. We'll talk about the specifics in a moment. And the overall, kind of like taking all these scores together into one single aggregate, we call this the full scale IQ. That score is 80, which places him at the 9th percentile, right? Which is, you know, that's relatively low. That means that basically, what would that be? 91% of all the other people who take this scored higher than him, right? So he may not have a lot of resources that he would want to have that would be optimal for him to be doing well in high school. And also remember, he's thinking about going to college. So that is of concern. Now, the other interesting thing here is that when you, there's different ways to slice and dice these scores. And actually, unfortunately, one of those ways that often can show some important, meaningful differences results in this score called the General Ability Index, and that's not meaningfully different. So these two, you can see that there are bars around them, and if the bars cross each other, if they overlap on the x-axis, then that means that the scores are not significantly different. And so again, that seems to be John's overall ability is around, you know, a standard score of 80, or the 9th percentile, which is in the low average range. Now, here's the other interesting thing. When we look at his scores on these four factors, which are, what do we want to call these? I'll call them indices, right? These measure different psychological abilities. And it turns out that, as you can see, he's got a relative strength here, and it turns out that this is probably his relative weakness. This score, the VCI, stands for the Verbal Comprehension Index. That's actually quite good at 95, right? That's the 37th percentile and well in the average range. And that is a huge strength for John. When we look at the specific tasks that comprise that, and we call these tasks subtests, each of them gets scored differently, individually, I should say. It turns out that out of all the tests, he scored highest on a scale that assessed his vocabulary, right? His fund of verbal knowledge. So that bodes well as an adaptive strength for him. So one of the things that we can say is that John has some really good, verbal skills that he can use in the service of, being successful in whatever endeavors he goes into, like say it's college. Now this low score here is called the Perceptual Reasoning Index, and this is, all right, actually I didn't even do this, let me back up here. So verbal comprehension, the index is really looking at someone's ability to use language to understand things, to express themselves, to conceptualize things using words, and all those verbal and language skills go together to make up this, to lead to someone having a score at a certain level on this scale. And this is a certain type of asset that many people, many people have, some people don't have. But he's generally speaking, we can say that he's good with words and with language. And that, in some ways, that does fit with his description of himself as, this sort of counselor type, this person who can be empathic for others, and people who are therapists tend to be very verbal. So now the Perceptual Reasoning Index is very different. That is measuring the ability to think not in words, but in abstract symbols, visual, spatial patterns. So all the tasks that go into this index, none of them involve words. They usually involve some array or set of symbols or a matrix of some sort that has a pattern in it. And the person has to sort of solve some kind of problem that has to do with these visual and spatial patterns. So this is a relative liability for him. His score here is the lowest, actually, of all of his scores, at the 5th percentile. And when we go and look at, I don't have this data to show you because I didn't make a slide for it, but when we go and show that, what it shows is that the one task that was really hard for him was a task that required him to put blocks together to make the blocks look like a particular picture, right? So there was a pattern and he had to use the blocks to make that same pattern. And so it requires you to manipulate things in three-dimensional space and also to make things look like the pattern. So that was really relatively difficult for him. And I'm just scrolling down here because I have some notes. I think that the really important thing about that was, that when we watched him do these tasks, it didn't look like the problem was with anxiety. It did not look like the problem was with attention. And it looked like it really had to do with his ability to work with visual spatial information. So that's a bit of information that we didn't have. And that might be something that is just a relative difficulty for John and might affect some of his ways of learning. So we'll talk in a minute about implications for education, but this is pretty important stuff, right? So we can see that, he's struggling in school for reasons other than mood. And this stuff adds to the picture of John's situation. So let's now look at the scores from the RAT, right? This is the achievement test. And I don't have a graph for you, but I'll just walk you through this. So there's 3 scales that we obtained. The first is, I'm listing them here, sentence comprehension. He has to read a sentence, and I think he has to answer a question so that it tells you whether he comprehended it or not. Score was really good, right? Consistent with the findings on the WACE. So good verbal abilities, he's doing well here. However, right, look at this. On spelling, he got a scaled or a standard score, right? Average is 100. Average range is 80 to 110, or really 109. His score was way lower than that at 66, right? The first percentile. So John has some difficulties with spelling, and that indicates some skills deficits, or, well, certainly spelling skills deficits, but it might indicate some specific weaknesses in his very, very specific cognitive processing abilities. Now that is something to be explored further. We didn't do that in our assessment, but that's a really important finding, because if he gets help with this, that could change things a lot for him. The other interesting thing is with math computation, right? Just having him do like math problems of progressive, that are progressively more difficult. He only performed at the 50, his score was 55, again, putting him at the first percentile. So these findings really are suggestive that it's very possible that John has the SLD, I'm sorry for that, the acronym without explaining it, specific learning disorder, right? There could be one in math, there could be one in spelling. That needs to be teased out. We can't tease that out. But clearly, again, intellectual and academic skills are problematic for this young man. And one possibility is that the difficulties that he's having in school certainly can impact his mood, right? All right, so now let's get on to some of the tests of personality. So again, self-report plus performance, right? Okay, so the PAI, just a brief description, 344-item self-report questionnaire, primarily designed to be used in the clinic to identify clinical problems. It doesn't have like it's not designed to tell people a lot of positive things about themselves because it's a clinical test. So, I have some favorite constructs that I'm trotting out here, but, things like creativity or altruism or, entrepreneurial abilities or any stuff, artistic talent or anything like that, that's not going to get measured here because it's used in the clinic. So let me show you the results. Again, I know I'm taking a lot of time here, so let me just jump through these. So some validity scales, these are scales that tell us whether he answered in a forthright manner. Did he seem to be trying his best? Did he understand the questions? These are all well within the normal range. Okay, so we're back at the scale that's called the T-scale, right? We're using 50 as the average, and then 70 to 30 is the broad average range, right? So we can just, shortcut is he did try his best with the test. What do we see on the clinical scales, which are the scales in the middle here? What we see is anxiety, depression, and then this scale is actually another anxiety scale that looks at specific clinical syndromes, right? These are very elevated, okay? Not surprisingly, in conjunction with these, he scored very highly on a scale that assesses suicidality. These items are worded so they pick up suicidality at any point in your life, and we very quickly interviewed him about that, and he, vehemently denied any current suicidality, but had been suicidal in the past and was acknowledging that. Now, here's the interesting thing. What's not here is mania, right? Mania is average, right? So here's the first direct test of the hypothesis that he has bipolar disorder that is contextualized, right? The other one was the MDQ, but that was a single item scale. And here we have, manic symptoms within the context of other kinds of symptoms, right? Now, I do have some other data here, but again, I'm a little strapped for time, and I know I've been keeping you guys on here. I think one of the things that I'll say, without going into too much detail, is that each of these scales, the author of this test designed each of these scales which measures clinical syndromes like mania, like depression, to have 3 subtests, and each of the 3 subtests were designed to measure independent components of that clinical syndrome. So here, for most of these scales, you're going to see 3 subtests. Like in depression, you've got these 3 scales. Here, John has scores higher than 70 on all 3. And the way that the sort of standard way of interpreting this is that if all 3 scores are around or above 70, then we can be relatively confident that this person is describing the clinical syndrome that the scale was measured or designed to measure, that it was built to measure, right? So we have that with depression. We have that with anxiety. It turns out over here that all 3 of these anxiety disorder related scales are fairly elevated. So that's interesting. And we don't have time to get into the nuances here, but the highest one, which is labeled phobias, really has to do with social discomfort, social quote, phobia, right? Like the being very self-conscious and being concerned about being evaluated. The mania scale, however, which is represented down here, 2 of these are getting a little high, activity level and irritability, but the grandiosity is on the floor, right? And that's very consistent with things like, I'm in the weeds here now, so bear with me. That's consistent with the high cognitive depression scale score, which often, those things you'll often see together, because this says that he's feeling badly about himself. And so we would not expect him to tell us that he feels great about himself here. Okay. All right. So enough said for that. I know I've given you lots to think about here. All right, let's talk about the RPAS. So the RPAS is the acronym for the Rorschach Performance Assessment System. The great thing about this test that I've kind of alluded to is that here we're asking people to respond to ambiguous stimuli. So when we do that, right, any urge that you as an individual or I might have as an individual to put our best foot forward, let's say, we wouldn't know how to do that, right? What's the best response that you can give to an ink blot? Who knows, right? I mean, you can think you know, but unless you're someone like myself who studied this, you wouldn't know what a good response is. So, so that's a really helpful thing because, as I said before, it can help us get what is often a very accurate picture. So let's take a look at the RPAS. So just to give you a sense of the RPAS, this is just one of the ink blots. There's 10 of them. We assessment psychologists would prefer it if people did not casually look at the ink blots, so that if you ever did have to take the test, they would be fresh and new to you. But because this test was invented in Switzerland, and not in the US, and because it was invented at the turn of the century, and the guy died soon after inventing it, it is not copyrighted. So you can, if you so desire, go on the internet and look at every single card, although I would encourage you not to, because for the reasons that I said. So this is one of the cards, and I don't know whether I can flip this. So the respondent can, we don't tell them how to do it, but you could look at this from any angle. And I don't think I can flip this, unfortunately. So, oh wait, maybe I can. No, I can't. So as you might imagine, if you look at this from different angles, there are lots of things that one can possibly see here. But there are also things that that the card pulls your eyes to sort of towards certain images, right? So that's the Rorschach. And all right, so let's just cut to the chase here. The most important thing for this case is that there are a number of empirical studies using the Rorschach that show that people who have been diagnosed with bipolar affective disorder as a group demonstrate, laser pointer ahead here, there we go, the laser pointer. Marked impairment in logical reasoning and perceptual accuracy, similar to people with schizophrenia, right? And there is some very interesting biogenetic research that's come out over the last decade or two that shows that while we make distinctions between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia on a clinical basis, that there are lots of shared genetic commonalities between them. And in fact, they may just be variants of the same, genetic liabilities for people. So they all, in addition to that, they also demonstrate, people with bipolar disorder demonstrate as a group a pattern of emotional dysmodulation, right? So we can take the Rorschach and we can look for those things in the Rorschach to test this hypothesis. All right, let's go ahead and do that. So here is just a printout from John's, these are John's Rorschach responses, coded, right? So we take his actual responses and we take each one. So these are the cards, there's 10 cards. He gave 22 responses to the cards. And then we have these codes that symbolize certain things about each response. So like the other tests, we have all these scoring rules. And it turns out that the RPAS in particular is, of all the psychological tests, in fact, arguably perhaps, well, I don't know whether I don't want to argue the big picture, but certainly of all the psychological tests, it's the one with the most research showing that the test is extremely valid in many, many ways. It has a reputation because I think in some ways, partially because of the way it's portrayed in movies and television shows, where a guy with a Viennese accent gives one card and gets one answer and then makes elaborate and unfounded interpretations. So I wanted to show you all how this really works and how it's a very rigorous and time-consuming process, much to the chagrin of many of my graduate students. And sometimes to myself, because it does take an investment to use this. All right, so here are the results. And it's a different way of looking, a different kind of graph than the ones you've seen because it's organized horizontally rather than vertically, right? But the principle is the same. We've got an average of 100, just like the Wechsler scale, the WACE. And the average range is going to go from 85, okay, so that's the low end of the first standard deviation, to 115. And I tried this earlier, maybe I'll try it again now. I wasn't very effective at it because it's hard to draw in a straight line with a mouse on this thing. But if we highlight that, there we go. And I try to stay straight with that line. We can, one interpretive start is to draw lines, at least in your mind and here with our highlighter, and to use this to decide, to make some preliminary decisions about what things are average and what things are not average, right? And as you can see, for John, many of his scores are well within the average range, and only a couple are outside of the average range. The other thing I'll show you, this is almost a prequel, is there are 2 pages to this printout. The first page has all the variables that have really, really, really good validity data. So we know that these things measure what they're intended to measure. The second set of scores are variables that have some support empirically, but we'd like to see them be better validated. So we, as clinicians, we remind ourselves that we don't want to put too much credence in this unless we see similar phenomena over on this page. All right, so again, I can go on, but let's just talk about the bipolar question. So where we would expect John to have high scores, or at least deviant scores of some sort, would be here, based on what I just showed you in that other slide, in the perception and thinking problems variables. And then also, here, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but some of these variables here have to do, and particularly this one here, has to do with emotion modulation, right? So what we see here is we do have this one high score that indicates that John may have some difficulty with emotion modulation. But what we also don't have is, we don't have any problems with thinking and the use of logic, right? So this is subtle, but an important distinction that one argument that I would say is that if John had a bipolar disorder, we would expect these scale scores here, at least some of them, to be over this yellow line, in many cases well over it, right? And we're not seeing that, right? What we're seeing instead is some difficulties with emotion modulation. And basically what this is telling us is that when he feels particular feelings, that he feels them very intensely, right? Now, the other thing that's interesting is the only other elevation here is on a scale that looks at the experience of anxiety, right? So we have these two findings here. We also, interestingly, down here, while these are just on the cusp of the average range, we have, this one is actually, when it's low, it indicates health, right? This is being able to conceptualize relationships in a positive way. So again, that maybe that refers to the counseling role that he, the sort of quasi-counseling supportive role that he's taken, and his interest in psychology. And then down here, actually this one isn't so meaningful when you have a low score. So all right, again, trying to be quick here and not take up too much time. So given those findings, some of the findings on the second page actually do fit. The W sum C here and this C, those are variables that again are related to affect modulation. And the C, basically, there's 4 of these C types of responses. That's extremely high. You can't get any higher on the scale, basically, I believe. And this is telling us, again, just over in a different way, that when John feels feelings, one way to think about it is that he may have difficulty retaining whatever conceptual framework he had in terms of ideas and thoughts when he was feeling the feelings. So he's definitely someone who feels things intensely. This thing is called C blend. This has to do with the feeling, those feelings can be painful, right? C blend is things that have the C responses in them, and they're blended with other responses, and the things that they're blended with in the scale are painful things, right? So his feelings can often be painful. Another interesting finding is this VG% regards the tendency to, at times, not conceptualize things in a clear or rigorous way, right? So that he may be sort of casual in his thinking, would be one brief way to say it. Again, there are some relative strengths in some of these, but bottom line, what we're seeing here is in both the PAI and the RPAS, we're seeing evidence that John probably does not have a bipolar disorder, but we are seeing plenty of other things, right? One of the other things that I'll mention in passing, again, I know I'm taking up a lot of time, is that in addition to looking at the formal scores, as we call them with the Rorschach, we can look at the content of what he says. And one important concept that I'll sort of help you guys with and give you some kind of an update your way of thinking about this is that it turns out that, not everything that someone says in response to the ink blot test involves projection, right? That was the original hypothesis, that people would project, their internal distress, discomfort, views, ideas onto the card, so to speak, and then that would be meaningful. Well, it turns out that we can't make meaning of every response, in the sense that we can't take every response as sort of a representation of how we internally think and feel about things. But there actually turn out to be several conditions. There are certain responses that, if they have certain features, the research has shown that those features are associated with the phenomena of projection. So when we find those responses, we can look at those and make meaning of them. And we can often think about those responses as implicit statements, right? So we can take the response and put it into the form of an I statement. I feel like, or I view myself like, or something to that effect. So here, one of John's more telling responses that did meet these criteria was someone with their head hanging down, someone holding them by their feet, and the rest is the body hanging, right? So that's a fairly vivid image of helplessness, right? And, you know, kind of an existentially precarious position to be in. And we can think about that as John is saying, like, I feel like I'm being held by the feet and I'm dangling over a precipice. He didn't put precipice in there, I'm taking liberties, but that's kind of the image, right? And so that can be really helpful in understanding what John is going through. And what could be leading him to that, feeling that could be, our findings are showing, that he is just really struggling with his academic stuff, right? So the other thing that we want to mention here is just pulling in, now this is the assessment part where I'm now in a very sort of fluid way, just going into the thought process that we had when we were interpreting these data. And here we can also think about, you know, some of the strengths that he had, right? So he was amazingly, his demeanor shifted really dramatically when he was talking about his feelings, and really had much more of a sense of confidence and authority and assertiveness about certain things that he felt, that felt truths to him. And so, you know, one alternative hypothesis that I alluded to when I constructed that chart is that John, instead of having bipolar disorder, he may be someone who tends to get caught up and carried away by his feelings, as a function of his attitude towards his emotions, right? And so specifically, we can create the hypothesis that John may view or act upon his emotional reactions, whether they're positive or negative, as if they're real rather than as if they're experiential states, right? And within the context of these other findings that do not support the bipolar diagnosis, you know, and this is just, I'm taking you through, like, if we were to formally do this, we could actually write a plus or a minus in each of these columns. And what we would find here is, in fact, I can probably do this, so let's play around with the technology here. We could say that while he did report a plus, oh, there it is, a plus, primitive plus. For the MDQ, right, the RPAS and the PAI were both minuses, right? And certainly his description of himself was a plus, but the behavioral observations of his parents were generally a minus, right? So what we do is we're, you know, this is a good illustration. Like, it's not like there's 100% conclusion that he doesn't have bipolar disorder, but we look at the quality of the data here. And, you know, given the quality of the observations, and actually, you know what, all right, observations there, here's, we should put a minus there because this is what I'm meant to be referring to. This is his parents' ratings. These things really are much more in the minus camp than the plus camp. And then, you know, if we were to go over here, the cognitive factors, this would be a big plus, right? For the WACE would be a plus. There are relative difficulties there. The academic screener, certainly the self-report stuff, he was describing not having a good time in school, although his parents weren't picking up on that. And certainly that came through in, actually not the notes so much, but his description of his life situation. And then over here, we've got this other hypothesis that, you know, here we could say that the PAI and the RPAS gave positive support that emotion regulation is a difficulty. And so on and so forth. All right, so that's, again, given the amount of time, hopefully that's clear to you. All right, so let's wrap up here. So, all right, so another thing that we can do is, remember I was talking about the theory, what is it, in Harry Potter, the wand chooses the wizard, right? So the person chooses the theory would be like an analog in the world of psychological assessment. It's a little corny, but I think it works. So here, what occurred to us when we were looking at all the data is that it might be possible that what's happening with John is that he might be, his distress might be in part, certainly it's probably related to the academic difficulties, but in part what might make it so profoundly difficult for him and lead him to think that he has bipolar disorder is that he might be engaging in what are called cognitive distortions, right? Oops, there we go. Cognitive distortions it's a concept from cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea is that these are common errors of thinking that people are inclined to make. And one very common one is the common distortion of what's called emotional reasoning, right? If I feel it, it must be true. So, this is a specific hypothesis that comes out of the data that we basically gave John this feedback, and his parents this feedback, and his therapist this feedback. And it's a testable hypothesis, right? The therapist can work with John and experiment with whether or not this hypothesis that we generated has value to him. And if it does, then that would validate the findings that we came up with. This is actually this is the part of the summary that we put in the report, which again, we don't have time to go through it, but as I'm talking, you're probably starting to read it. And you can see that this summary is very contextualized. It's very holistic. It tries to take into account context, different contexts, and talk about conditions under which he can function well and conditions under which he can't function well. So it's a much more nuanced way of looking at a person than merely looking at 1 or 2 or 3 scores from a test. Okay, so recommendations that we made: John would benefit from ongoing work with his therapist. Also, importantly, because he was going away to college and it was far enough away that he couldn't easily continue seeing his therapist, we suggest that, it might be a good idea ahead of time, because this assessment was done in the spring before, so he had the summer and then he would be going to college in the fall, that he could maybe try to make contact with the counseling center and maybe even get something set up for the first week of college, so that he had resources for himself in college. Certainly we recommended that he and his therapist and his parents talk about the results of the assessment. And one of the things that we talked about was, encouraging him to use, again, these are some tools that are used by therapists to maybe track his mood and to gather more data about his moods. And to ideally, given what we found, we would expect that he might find not a lot of evidence of significant mood problems, but to actually understand his moods even further, right? If it's not bipolarity, which is theorized to be this internal biologically driven thing, maybe there are some things like schoolwork and thinking about schoolwork that are stressing for him, thinking about going away to college that are stressing to him, that he could start to identify, hey, whenever I think about this or I'm faced with this, then I have these problems. Okay, then another thing that we recommended was, the referral didn't come in being about OCD, but John described OCD symptoms. There's a particular type of treatment called exposure and response prevention that is highly effective for OCD. And it involves these steps here that you can see. And it's difficult, but it works very well. And if John wanted to, he could consider, maybe not right away, but at some point, engaging in that type of treatment, either with a new therapist or his current therapist, or whatever worked for him. Certainly, given some of the findings of the PAI and the RPAS, and even on the BASC, which is the self-report overall scales, some problem-solving skills seem to be underdeveloped. We thought that it would be good for him to actually, maybe he would just benefit from sitting down and having someone teach him, like in a very explicit way rather than an implicit way, problem-solving skills. And then, he could work with his therapist or, a coach or whoever, or one of his parents, maybe his dad, on, developing those skills and applying them on a more regular basis. In fact, this is an algorithm for problem solving that some of you may have, there's a lot of variations on this, but this is kind of a common one where, it's a general algorithm that you could basically cut and paste into a lot of different situations, right? So those are the kinds of things that you would benefit from. In cognitive and behavioral therapy, there's the original sort of modality of cognitive and behavioral therapy was what's called cognitive restructuring techniques. We recommended that there's a very popular book that has made a lot of money for its author over the years, and I've contributed to his wealth, I think. Hopefully he's gotten the boat that he always wanted, called Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy. And this is a great book. It's basically a primer about cognitive and behavior therapy. And there are other really good ones out there, but I just happened to grow up in the era, be trained in the era where that was the popular one that we were using. So that we recommended that to him. We also talked a little bit about, certainly being proactive about possible resurgence of suicidality. And that would be something that anyone who's treating him could work with him on. And these are some of the ideas that are not from the data, but are from the research on suicide. Also, certainly reconsider the mood stabilizing medicine and dialogue with the provider, right? He wasn't seeing the psychiatrist who had initially provided it. I think he was getting his medication from a primary care doctor at that point. And, having a conversation about that and, being deliberative before pulling the plug on that. And, ideally doing it in a very tapered and gradual way if they decided to do it. And then also clearly having further dialogue with his parents around the findings. And then also, we recommended that maybe he get a further, more comprehensive educational assessment. I actually have a colleague who works not all that far from where John and his family are, so we recommended that he see that person for further workup. Looking at, what's going on with math in particular, and also with the spelling stuff. Also considering, there's, in addition to getting worked up further, considering compensatory strategies. This was my graduate student was very interested in this stuff, so she worked up some recommendations for him, like video learning or text-to-speech reading, that kind of stuff, right? This is, right, just saying what I already said, the psychoeducational evaluation. This is my colleague, Rich Selznick. He is very well known as a psychoeducational specialist, and he's actually written a bunch of books. And this book is actually a very helpful book for people who have been demoralized because they either have or may have a learning disorder. Okay. All right. So the outcome. In some ways, I chose this case because we had outcome data. Sometimes we don't have much outcome data because they see us and then they move on. So John, we met with John and his dad. John was not happy to hear that we thought that he did not have bipolar disorder, because I think in his mind, this was really a way to understand himself. His dad was very happy. They both found the psychoeducational findings really helpful. And his dad was actually very interested in seeing if they could get accommodations at college. And I had to, one thing that I end up having to do a fair amount is educate people about, what are the limits of the uses of the report that I generate. Oftentimes my report is focused on, again, helping the person understand themselves. Sometimes it can be helpful, but in his case, I'm not sure that I collected enough data about the educational stuff for them to use. John continued meeting with this therapist every every 2 or 3 weeks until he went away to college. His primary care doctor and the therapist, and he decided to have him discontinue the medication. He went back on an antidepressant instead. He was reluctant to go to a new counselor or therapist at his college, so he stuck with his home practice and didn't see his therapist there all that often, but did come on break to see the therapist. And this recently would be back in March, when I was supposed to originally give this, March of 2020. I had seen the therapist and communicated with the therapist, and the therapist told me that John had told the therapist that he was very relieved that the educational difficulties were clearly, described, so that his parents understood and his teachers. And, one of the interesting dynamics that we didn't manage to learn more about is that, his father was a school administrator and was a former teacher. So, one might be curious about, the extent to which that played a role in, John's difficulties not being more fully understood until he was a senior in high school. And that's paradoxical, right, on the surface. But, perhaps sometimes people don't want to think that they or people associated with them have certain kinds of difficulties, right? Maybe a stigma in the dad's mind. Just a speculation, right? I don't really know. The therapist did indicate that John did have a relapse of cutting behavior, but he was able to recover. He finished his first semester successfully, which had been a worry for me. And he did see the therapist for follow-up sessions during the winter break. So relatively speaking, that was a pretty, there's still miles to go in the journey, so to speak. But, it sounds like the assessment was relatively helpful to him. And all right, so that is a very, actually there's a lot of detail there, but in some ways very quick and hopefully thorough review of how I do psychological assessment in this therapeutic assessment modality. And my hope is that this will give you an appreciation for psychological assessment, and that you'll tell all your friends and family to go get one. No, I'm just kidding, obviously. But that you can see the utility of it. And what we're finding is that while I've been working at Christian Care for a long time, that there are more and more practitioners who are finding usefulness of psychosocial types of interventions such as this. And I think that in some ways that's part of the broader integration of behavioral health and traditional medicine. And it's very gratifying to see. And we are getting a lot of people using our services for different things. So one last thing I'll say, this is actually just some stuff for you guys to look at to further your interests. As you probably already know, because many of you might, I think it's not that uncommon to go out and take tests on the internet. A lot of those tests are just made up tests that have no validity at all. No one collected data. They're what we call face valid, because the questions that are made up appear to measure something, but often they don't really have any actual demonstrated validity. But it turns out that there are some tests that are public domain that if you're interested in this type of stuff, you're welcome to go and take the test, and I think they'll give you the results. I actually personally haven't had the bandwidth to have time to sit down and take these myself. But there's this very interesting movement within the personality assessment field where some people really would like to see personality assessment be more of a public domain endeavor where all the data is shared. A lot of the tests that I showed you are proprietary, so we have to pay for them. And while we understand, it's sort of like drug companies, right? You understand that it takes lots of money and time and effort to make the tests. One of the dilemmas is that the test publishers don't always share all the data with the clinicians and the researchers such as myself. So as a result of that, there's a movement, and that's this Hexaco personality inventory is part of that movement. to make more public domain tests. So you can go on their site and get that one. And then the VIA Institute on Character is actually, I mentioned this guy, Martin Seligman, who was the president of the American Psychological Association some time ago. He's up at Penn, and he is all about positive psychology. And this comes from his work, although I don't know that it's directly affiliated with it. And this is a test that you can take that looks at character strengths. So I hope you've appreciated this. It's been fun doing it. And again, if people are interested in having assessments or want to know more about what I do or where they can get assessed if they're going off to some far-flung location, feel free to drop me an email. And that's it for today. Thanks.